It was 3:04 a.m. when the first armored vehicle rolled past the Independence Monument. The streets of Ouagadougou were silent, but not asleep. Inside the lead convoy, General Doumbié sat stone-faced, flanked by men who had sworn loyalty to him just hours earlier. His orders were clear: remove President Ibrahim Traoré by dawn. Backed by foreign whispers and promises of power, Doumbié believed the capital was his to claim. But the city was watching. From rooftops, from alleyways, from the shadows of shuttered shops, eyes followed the convoy's slow crawl toward the presidential compound. The general mistook silence for surrender. What he didn't know was that Traoré had already dismantled the coup before it began. Inside the compound, Traoré stood in uniform, calm, unshaken. He had intercepted the foreign communications. He had tracked Doumbié's secret meetings. And he had done something no one expected. He let the convoy come. Because this wasn't just a coup. It was a test. As Doumbié's forces approached the final checkpoint, something shifted. Radios crackled. Orders were reversed. Soldiers began hesitating. Some refused to advance. Others turned their weapons away from the compound and toward their own commander. By sunrise, the man who came to kill the president was surrounded. Not by Traoré's guards, but by his own troops. And they weren't asking for orders. They were demanding answers. He came to kill the president. By sunrise, he was begging his own soldiers for mercy. But Traoré had already seen it coming. And what he did next stunned the entire continent. Burkina Faso had become a chessboard soaked in gasoline. Every move sparked tension. Every silence felt like the calm before a storm. In just 3 years, the country had seen 2 coups, each promising stability, each delivering deeper fractures. Foreign powers circled like vultures, offering aid with one hand and influence with the other. The people had grown weary of uniforms and speeches. What they wanted was peace. What they feared was collapse. General Doumbié wasn't the first to dream of power, but he was the most dangerous. Unlike past plotters, he had connections, quiet meetings with foreign diplomats, encrypted messages routed through embassies, promises of recognition if he could restore order. His rise through the ranks had been swift, his loyalty to Traoré always just convincing enough. But beneath the salute was ambition. And behind the ambition, a plan. The military itself was splintering. Some officers believed in Traoré's vision, a Burkina Faso free from foreign manipulation, led by its own people. Others whispered that the young president was too idealistic, too bold, too much of a threat to the old order. Doumbié played both sides, feeding doubts, sowing division, waiting for the moment when the cracks would become a chasm. And that moment came when a foreign intelligence report, leaked to Doumbié, claimed Traoré was planning to purge the army. It was false, but it was enough. Doumbié activated his network. Vehicles were mobilized. Loyalists were bribed. The coup was set in motion. Outside the capital, villagers prayed. Inside the capital, activists braced for chaos. The international community issued vague statements. And Traoré? He said nothing, because he wasn't cornered. He was calculating. He had seen the signs. He had traced the money. He had watched Doumbié's rise with quiet eyes and a patient heart. And now, as the convoy rolled toward the palace, Traoré stood ready, not to fight, but to reveal. Everyone thought Traoré was cornered, but the real game hadn't even begun. General Doumbié was once the man Traoré trusted most. They had fought side by side in the northern provinces, where the dust never settled and the enemy never slept. Doumbié was sharp, disciplined, and charismatic, the kind of officer who could command a room with a glance. Traoré saw in him a brother in arms, someone who understood the weight of leadership and the cost of loyalty. But Doumbié had always played a longer game. Born into privilege, he attended the finest military academies in France, where he learned not just tactics, but politics. He returned to Burkina Faso with medals on his chest and foreign contacts in his phone. While Traoré built trust among the rank and file, Doumbié built influence among diplomats and businessmen. He wore his uniform like a costume, polished boots, pressed collars, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Behind closed doors, Doumbié began hosting quiet dinners with foreign envoys. He spoke of stability, of economic opportunity, of strategic partnerships. He painted Traoré as a well-meaning idealist, brave, yes, but naive. He promised that under his leadership, Burkina Faso would be open for business. The guests nodded. The deals began to form. Traoré knew. He saw the shift in Doumbié's posture, the way he lingered near foreign delegations, the sudden influx of luxury vehicles around his residence. But he said nothing, because betrayal, when it comes from a friend, is not something you confront with rage. It's something you study, patiently. Doumbié's arrogance grew. He began issuing orders without clearance. He questioned Traoré's decisions in closed meetings. He leaked internal memos to foreign press. And still, Traoré did not react. To the public, they remained united. To the military, they were a team. But beneath the surface, the fracture was widening. Then came the tipping point. Before the chants, before the flags, before the headlines, Ibrahim Traoré was just a quiet artillery officer with dust on his boots and questions in his heart. He didn't speak much in meetings. He listened. He didn't chase rank. He earned respect. In a military culture obsessed with bravado, Traoré was the anomaly, calm, deliberate, and deeply aware of the weight his uniform carried. He grew up in a modest home in Bobo de Lasso, where his mother taught him that silence could be strength and that dignity wasn't something you wore, it was something you lived. As a young cadet, he was often overlooked, too reserved, too principled. But when the northern insurgency escalated and the battlefield demanded more than medals, Traoré emerged. He didn't just fight. He led. Stories spread of how he refused to abandon wounded comrades, how he negotiated ceasefires with rebel factions without firing a single shot, how he carried water to villagers after long marches. His courage wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, and that made it unforgettable. While others climbed the ranks through politics, Traoré built something deeper, trust. Among soldiers, among civilians, among those who had stopped believing in leadership altogether. He didn't promise change. He embodied it. When the first coup rocked Burkina Faso, Traoré was offered a promotion. He declined. He said the country didn't need more generals. It needed guardians. That line would later be quoted across social media, etched onto murals, whispered in protests. And when the second coup came and the nation teetered again, it was Traoré who stepped forward, not with a parade, but with a plan. He reorganized the military, cut ties with exploitative foreign contracts, and began listening to the youth. Not just hearing them, listening. His rise wasn't meteoric. It was methodical. He studied Doumbié's movements. He tracked foreign influence. He built a network of loyalists not through fear, but through shared purpose. And when whispers of betrayal began to surface, Traoré didn't panic. He prepared. Because he wasn't just ready for the coup. He had already rehearsed its collapse. At 4:17 a.m., the first breach was reported. Armed units loyal to General Doumbié stormed the Ministry of Defense, silencing guards and cutting off internal communications. Within minutes, the National Broadcast Center went dark. Screens across the country flickered, then faded to black. The coup had begun. Doumbié moved swiftly. His men secured checkpoints, blocked major roads, and deployed armored vehicles around key government buildings. The capital was under siege, not by rebels, but by its own protectors. The silence was suffocating. No official statements. No emergency alerts. Just the hum of engines and the distant crackle of radios. Inside the presidential compound, Traoré stood in his office, watching the chaos unfold on a private monitor. His advisors urged action. Mobilize the loyalists. Issue a countercommand. Call the press. But Traoré raised a hand and said nothing. Because this wasn't panic. It was patience. Doumbié, confident in his momentum, entered the military command center flanked by officers who had pledged allegiance hours earlier. He ordered the arrest of Traoré's inner circle. He demanded the surrender of the presidential guard. He declared himself interim leader, off camera, off record, but with full conviction. And still, Traoré did not respond. Across the city, soldiers waited. Some confused, some conflicted, others simply afraid. The lines of loyalty blurred. The air felt heavy with betrayal. But Traoré knew something Doumbié didn't. The coup was already collapsing. Because loyalty built on fear is fragile. And Doumbié's foundation was cracking. Then came the moment that changed everything. At 5:02 a.m., a single radio transmission echoed across military channels. It wasn't from Traoré. It was from a junior officer, one Doumbié had overlooked. The message was clear. Operation Mirage is compromised. Stand down. The president is in control. Within seconds, units began to hesitate. Orders were questioned. Vehicles reversed course. And Doumbié, once surrounded by allies, found himself encircled by silence. The coup was unraveling, and Traoré hadn't lifted a finger. The sun had barely crested the horizon when General Doumbié realized something was wrong. His orders were being questioned. His convoy stalled. His men, once unwavering, now exchanged glances instead of salutes. The coup, which had been planned down to the minute, was unraveling in real time, and he couldn't understand why. He stormed into the command center, demanding updates. Silence. The screens showed static. The radio lines were jammed. His most trusted colonel refused to meet his eyes. And then, without warning, the doors opened. Ibrahim Traoré walked in. No guards. No entourage. Just the president, in fatigues, calm as a mountain breeze. The room froze. Doumbié's hand hovered near his holster, but Traoré didn't flinch. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the man who had come to kill him. "You thought I didn't know," Traoré said softly. "You thought I wouldn't see the meetings, the transfers, the promises." Doumbié tried to speak, but Traoré raised a hand. "I let you come," he continued, "because I needed everyone to see who you really are." Then, one by one, screens flickered to life. Surveillance footage played. Doumbié in secret meetings with foreign envoys, accepting briefcases, signing documents. Audio recordings echoed through the room. His voice, his plans, his betrayal. The officers around him turned pale. Traoré had infiltrated Doumbié's inner circle days before the coup. He had planted loyalists in key positions, rerouted communications, and monitored every move. He didn't stop the coup. He choreographed its collapse. Outside, loyalist units surrounded the capital. Roads were sealed. Airspace was locked. Doumbié's forces were encircled, not by enemies, but by their own brothers who had chosen truth over treachery. And then came the final blow. Traoré ordered Doumbié and his co-conspirators to be escorted, not to prison, but to the national stadium. Word spread like wildfire. By midday, tens of thousands had gathered. The air buzzed with disbelief. The man who had tried to seize power was about to face the people. Traoré stood at the center of the field, microphone in hand. Doumbié, flanked by silent guards, stood behind him. The crowd roared. Cameras rolled. The world watched. "I was told to fear betrayal," Traoré began. "But I chose to trust the people." He turned to Doumbié. "You were my brother. You were supposed to protect this country. Instead, you sold it." Doumbié looked down. Traoré raised his voice. "But Burkina Faso is not for sale. Not to generals. Not to foreigners. Not to fear." The crowd erupted. Flags waved. Tears flowed. Then, in a move no one expected, Traoré stepped aside and handed the microphone to a young soldier, one of Doumbié's own men who had refused to follow the coup orders. The soldier spoke. "I was told to arrest the president. I chose to protect him." The crowd fell silent. Traoré had not just exposed a traitor. He had elevated a patriot. He had turned a moment of collapse into a lesson in courage. And just when the crowd thought it was over, Traoré did something no African leader had ever done before. By noon, the streets of Ouagadougou were no longer silent. They were alive, pulsing with chants, music, and the thunder of footsteps. Citizens poured out of homes, offices, and markets, waving flags, raising fists, and shouting one name: Traoré. The coup had failed, but what followed was more than relief. It was a celebration of something long buried: pride. Social media ignited like wildfire. Within hours, #TraoréTrap was trending across Africa, then globally. Videos of Doumbié's stunned face in the stadium circulated with captions like "Checkmate" and "Africa's New Lion." TikTok creators reenacted the mic drop moment. Twitter exploded with praise. One post read, "This wasn't just a counter-coup. It was a masterclass in loyalty, intelligence, and leadership." Celebrities joined in. Nigerian artists, South African activists, and diaspora influencers from Paris to Atlanta hailed Traoré as a modern-day Sankara. Memes compared his calm walk into the command center to scenes from political thrillers. Commentators on international news channels called it the most elegant takedown of a coup in modern African history. But the ripple effects weren't just digital. In Bamako, Dakar, and Abidjan, youth-led marches erupted in solidarity. Murals of Traoré appeared overnight on city walls. University students debated his strategy in packed lecture halls. For many, he wasn't just a president. He was proof that dignity could still win. Foreign governments scrambled. Embassies issued statements of support for democratic stability. Intelligence agencies quietly reviewed their files. Some officials who had once courted Doumbié now deleted messages, distanced themselves, and rephrased their positions. The balance of power had shifted, not through war, but through wisdom. Inside Burkina Faso, the mood was electric. Soldiers who had once hesitated now saluted with pride. Families gathered around radios to hear updates. Children wore shirts with Traoré's silhouette. And in the stadium where betrayal had been exposed, a new chant echoed. Burkina Faso is awake. But Traoré didn't bask in the glory. He didn't call for vengeance. He didn't boast. Instead, he prepared a message. Because for him, this wasn't about victory. It was about something deeper. The stadium was still. The crowd, once roaring, now leaned in with reverent silence. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium, not as a victor, but as a servant of the people. His voice, steady and clear, cut through the morning air like a drumbeat of truth. This was not a battle for power, he began. It was a test of who we are and who we refuse to become. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Behind him, the flags of Burkina Faso fluttered in the breeze, no longer symbols of a fractured nation, but of one that had stared down betrayal and stood tall. They told us we were weak, Traoré continued, that we needed foreign hands to guide us, that our soil, our soldiers, our spirit were for sale. He looked out at the crowd, eyes meeting those of elders, students, mothers, and fighters. But today, he said, we proved that our dignity is not negotiable. The betrayal had been deep. A trusted general, backed by foreign interests, had tried to hijack the soul of the nation. But Traoré didn't dwell on vengeance. He reframed the moment, not as a scar, but as a badge of resilience. This coup was not our downfall, he declared. It was our awakening. He spoke of unity, not the kind written into constitutions, but the kind forged in the fire of shared struggle. He praised the soldiers who refused to follow illegal orders, the citizens who stayed vigilant, the youth who flooded the streets not with violence, but with vision. You are the guardians of this republic, he said, not because you carry weapons, but because you carry truth. Then, he turned to the cameras, to the world watching. To those who believe Africa must always be managed, manipulated, or molded, hear this. We are not your experiment. We are not your pawn. We are not your silence. The crowd erupted, but Traoré raised his hand again, calling for calm. This is not the time to gloat, he said. It is the time to build. He laid out a vision, one rooted in service, not ego. He promised reforms that would decentralize power, elevate local voices, and protect the nation's sovereignty. He called on intellectuals, farmers, artists, and soldiers to join hands in shaping a future that honored their ancestors and inspired their children. Leadership is not domination, he said. It is devotion. He spoke of Sankara, of Lumumba, of Nkrumah, not as distant legends, but as reminders that African greatness is not a myth. It is a memory waiting to be revived. And then, with the sun rising behind him, Traoré offered his final words. We did not win today because we were stronger, he said. We won because we were truer. A hush fell over the stadium. And as the sun rose over Ouagadougou, one thing was clear. Africa had found its voice. He came to kill the president. By sunrise, he was begging his own soldiers for mercy. But this story was never just about a failed coup. It was about the power of integrity in a world addicted to shortcuts. It was about a leader who chose patience over panic, truth over treachery, and service over self-interest. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just survive an attack. He transformed it into a moment of national clarity. In exposing betrayal, he revealed the strength of a people who refused to be pawns. In standing firm, he reminded the world that African leadership is not defined by foreign approval, but by the will of its own citizens. This wasn't a victory speech. It was a mirror held up to every viewer, every voter, every dreamer who believes that dignity still matters. So if you felt something watching this, pride, hope, fire, don't let it fade. Subscribe for more stories where dignity defeats deception. Share this if you believe Africa deserves leaders who serve, not betray. Because this isn't just Traoré's story. It's ours. And it's only just beginning.